My boyfriend picked his sister over me simply because she was broke. Until I discovered she'd been lying about everything entirely. Emotional hook, midnight to 010. Have you ever fallen so completely in love that you ignored every single blaring red flag, only to find yourself trapped in someone else's toxic family drama? What if the person you loved most was caught in a web of manipulation, and the only way out was to shatter everything? Bad weather seems to have this twisted habit of crashing into my biggest life moments. The day I met my boyfriend, the sky looked like it was threatening to flood the entire town, and the wind was literally pushing people sideways as they stepped out of their cars. Someone, God bless their soul, still thought it was a brilliant idea to go ahead with this community fundraiser in a rental hall on the edge of nowhere. So there I was, in a thrift store dress, clutching a plastic cup of lukewarm, flat soda, trying my absolute best to pretend I wasn't shivering every time the door flew open, letting another gust of icy wind and a new batch of strangers in. My name's Karen, by the way. And back then, I was the undisputed queen of pretending everything was fine, even when my whole life felt like one long, precarious juggling act. I was an office assistant at a tiny clinic, renting a shoebox apartment that smelled perpetually of someone else's cooking, no matter what I did. And let's be honest, I was not the kind of person who expected true love to show up at a folding table covered with a wrinkled tablecloth and some badly arranged cupcakes. But there he was, stacking chairs, a volunteer badge hanging crooked on his chest, laughing at something a kid said, all while trying not to drop an entire stack of folding chairs at once. He walked over when he saw me standing alone near the snack table. He asked if I needed help wrestling open one of the stubborn drink bottles, and I, in my nervous glory, joked that if the bottle didn't want to be opened, maybe it knew something I didn't. He laughed. A genuine, warm, loud laugh. Like I was actually funny, not just babbling from nerves. We ended up talking for hours. The storm howled outside, people came and went, and the organizers debated out loud if they should just call it a night before someone's car ended up in a ditch. It felt weirdly easy to talk to him. Like I'd known him for years and just forgotten. He told me he worked long shifts at a warehouse, sometimes overnight, sometimes dawn patrol, whatever they needed, because he had a mortgage and wanted to pay it down as fast as humanly possible. He talked about that house like it was his biggest accomplishment, his proudest moment. The way some people talk about finally getting a degree or opening their own business. There was this light in his eyes, like the house wasn't just drywall and paint, but proof he'd clawed his way out of some truly dark place. I found out what that dark place was later that night. Or, rather, who. When I finally met his sister. He hadn't brought her up right away. We'd already added each other on social media, already swapped numbers, already promised we'd see each other again when the weather stopped trying to kill everyone. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned her. He said he didn't live alone, that his sister stayed with him, that she'd been through a lot, and that the situation was complicated. He said complicated the way people do when they desperately hope you won't ask follow-up questions. I didn't push. I had my own complicated people. I knew what it was like to have that one relative whose name made you tense up a little, because you never knew what state they'd be in when you walked through the door. I just nodded and told him I understood. And I genuinely meant it. I truly believed I could handle it. I didn't realize yet that the house he loved so much was basically a stage where his entire family had been performing the same unhealthy play for years. And I was about to walk in as the new character no one wanted to rewrite the script for. We started dating a few days later. The storm passed, the roads cleared, and our messages turned into phone calls, then into late-night drives where he'd pick me up after work, still in his uniform, eyes tired but bright when he looked at me. He told me stories about working double shifts to save for that down payment, about sleeping in his car between shifts while his friends were out partying. I told him about my boring little apartment and my even more boring job, about how I'd always felt like I was just waiting for my real life to start. The first time he invited me over to see the house, he looked almost shy when he handed me the spare key he'd made just for me. He said it like that mattered, like a spare key meant something bigger than just metal and teeth, and a place to hang it. I remember standing on the front porch, looking at the kind of house I used to drive past and just assumed didn't belong to people like me. It wasn't a mansion, nothing like that, just a 3-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood with trees lining the street and kids riding bikes in circles in the cul-de-sac. But to him, it was everything. And standing there, listening to him talk about how long it had taken to fix the fence, how proud he was of the new roof, I started to feel protective of it too. Even though my name was nowhere near the paperwork. The sister came to the door before I even stepped inside. She opened it halfway, looked me up and down in one slow scan that made me suddenly very aware of my cheap shoes and the way my hair had frizzled from the humidity. She had that kind of posture that says, without a word, that this is her territory. She didn't smile. She didn't introduce herself. She just looked at her brother, then at the hand he had at the small of my back, and said in this flat voice that dinner was already in the oven, and could they please not make a mess in the kitchen. He told her my name and said I was the person he'd been talking about. She nodded, still not smiling, and stepped aside just enough for us to pass. I have never, in my life, felt so much hostility in a hallway. It was like walking through invisible spiderwebs. I tried to brush it off. People have bad days. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she was anxious. Maybe the story he hadn't told me yet was heavier than I realized. We sat in the living room, and I tried to look at the house through his eyes. The furniture was simple but clean. The walls were painted a neutral color that probably came with whatever contractor special they picked. And there were framed photos on every surface. In almost all of them, it was him and her. Different ages, different haircuts, sometimes a third person, sometimes not, but always them. There were no pictures of anyone else. No parents on the mantle, no cousins, no old girlfriends. Just him and his sister, locked in time, over and over again. She sat in the armchair across from us and started asking questions in this weirdly polite but sharp tone. Where did I work? How much did I make? Did I live alone? How long had I lived in the city? Did I have debt? She didn't even pretend to be subtle about it. It felt like a job interview where the job was gaining access to her brother's life. I could see him shifting uncomfortably beside me, but he didn't stop her. He answered for me a few times, trying to steer the conversation somewhere lighter, but she kept circling back to money, to stability, to what my long-term plans were. When I said I eventually wanted to move out of my apartment and maybe buy something smaller for myself, she gave this little smirk and said that buying property wasn't for everyone. She said it like I'd claimed I wanted to colonize another planet. I just laughed it off, because I really didn't want to start a fight in a living room I'd just set foot in. I didn't know yet that the living room, the questions, the photos, all of it, were part of a structure she had built to keep him orbiting around her forever. Later that night, when he drove me home, he apologized for her. He said she'd been through a lot, that her husband had left her out of nowhere, that the divorce had been brutal, and that after it all blew up, she'd tried to end her life. He said she moved in with him 5 years ago after that, and she'd never really left. He said he'd promised their parents he would keep her safe. He said he knew she could be intense, but she was fragile, and he needed me to be patient. I remember staring out the car window, watching the streetlights blur by, and feeling this knot form in my stomach. On one hand, I understood. Trauma isn't neat. People don't heal on a schedule. On the other hand, 5 years. 5 years of living in his house, paying nothing, controlling the space. 5 years of every picture being just the two of them. 5 years of being the fragile one who everyone tiptoed around. I told him I could try. I told him I liked him enough to at least try. I told myself I could be the bigger person, the understanding girlfriend who didn't get jealous of a sister who had clearly been through hell. I didn't realize yet that trying to be the bigger person in a house where everyone else refuses to grow up just means you become the tallest target in the room. The months that followed were this weird mix of sweetness and tension. When it was just me and him, everything felt easy. We cooked. We watched dumb shows. We took late-night drives to get ice cream from whatever place was still open. We talked about everything and nothing. But whenever she was home, the whole house shifted. She claimed the living room every single night, sprawled out on the couch with a blanket, the television volume set just loud enough that you couldn't really ignore it. If we tried to sit out there, she'd sigh dramatically, or pause what she was watching and wait until we left, or start some conversation about her day that was clearly meant to drown out whatever we were talking about. I tried, at first, to make conversation with her. I offered to cook together. I asked about her job. I asked how she was feeling now compared to when everything fell apart. Sometimes she'd engage for a few minutes, but it always turned into some backhanded comment. She'd say I was lucky to still believe relationships could work out. She'd ask if I was ready to support her brother when he burned out from working so many shifts. She'd joke about how people always show their best version at the beginning and then start rotting from the inside once they feel safe. I started venting to the neighbor without even meaning to. She lived next door in a little house with flowers on the porch and a wind chime that never stopped tinkling. She introduced herself one afternoon when I was leaving and she was coming home with grocery bags, and it just became this thing where we'd wave, say a few words, and then one day I just spilled. I told her about the living room, about the questions, about the sister who treated me like a threat to be neutralized instead of a person. The neighbor sighed in that deep, knowing way that older women sigh, and told me gently that the situation had been tense long before I showed up. She said she had watched the sister strut around like she owned the place for years while the brother ran himself into the ground trying to make everyone happy. I didn't like hearing that. I didn't like feeling like I was walking into a mess that existed before me and might exist long after me. But I also liked him. I liked how he looked at me like he genuinely saw me. I liked how he remembered tiny details about my day that I'd already forgotten. I liked how, when it was just us, I didn't feel like I was auditioning for a part. So I stayed. I tried to make it work. The night I first stayed over, really stayed, like toothbrush in the bathroom, pajamas folded on his dresser, the sister watched me like a hawk. She didn't even pretend to be discreet about it. Every time I crossed the hallway, she looked up. Every time I went into the kitchen, she appeared 5 seconds later, acting like she needed a glass of water, or a snack, or to wipe a counter that was already clean. She waited until he went to take a shower before bed to corner me in the hallway. She leaned against the wall like it was her throne and I was trespassing in her kingdom. She asked if I had given any thought to how my schedule would fit around their routine. I blinked, because I honestly didn't know what she meant. She explained, slowly, like I wasn't very bright, that she always watched her shows at a certain time, that she liked the kitchen a certain way, that she needed the bathroom free at certain hours in the morning because of her sensitive stomach. She asked what I planned to contribute to the house financially, cleaning-wise, emotionally, as if those were all equal categories. I said I didn't know yet, that we hadn't talked about moving in, that I was just staying the night. She gave me that little smirk again and said that women didn't leave toothbrushes in bathrooms unless they had a plan. I wanted to tell her that her brother had asked me to, that he was the one pushing for more time together, that I was just trying to keep up. Instead, I said nothing because the shower turned off and I didn't want him stepping into a full-blown fight the second he opened the door. Later, when we were in his room with the door closed, he seemed so happy to have me there that I didn't bring it up. I told myself I'd talk to him another time. A better time. That better time kept getting pushed back because something always seemed to be burning in that house, even when there was no smoke. Months passed. We fell into a rhythm that didn't really feel like mine, but I tried to fit into it anyway. I got used to keeping my voice down after a certain hour because she claimed to be a light sleeper. I got used to working around her moods when I needed to use the washing machine. I got used to sitting on the edge of his bed instead of on the couch if she was already sprawled there, even when she was clearly just doom-scrolling on her phone with the television on as background noise. The first big sabotage came on a night that was supposed to be romantic. He had actually planned something. He asked his parents to take his sister out for dinner, told them he wanted some alone time at the house for once, and he spent the day cleaning and cooking, trying his best to make the place feel like ours instead of his and hers. I showed up with a bottle of cheap sparkling juice and a head full of hope. There were candles, music, a table set for two. It was the kind of effort people tell you men never make anymore. His parents sent a message saying they were on their way to pick her up. She came down the hallway dressed up, makeup done, hair perfect, acting like she was the main event. And for a minute, I thought, maybe she was going to be happy for him. She hugged him. She even nodded at me in what might have been her version of politeness. And then, right before she reached the door, she stopped. She turned back and said she felt sick. Her stomach hurt. Her head hurt. She didn't think she could go out after all. She looked at him with these huge eyes, like a child asking not to be left behind. His parents arrived, confused, tried to convince her, but she clutched her stomach and said she felt like she might pass out. They left without her. The candles on the table suddenly felt ridiculous. She flopped on the couch, grabbed the blanket, and turned on some loud show. I looked at him. He looked at me. He said he was sorry, that he would talk to her tomorrow. I said it was fine. I understood. But my chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. We ended up eating in the bedroom with the door closed while the television roared from the living room. I told myself this was just one bad night. I told myself that when people are fragile, they sometimes panic at the last minute. I didn't want to be the girlfriend who demanded he ignore his sister's supposed distress just so we could have a nice dinner. So, I swallowed my disappointment and my resentment along with overcooked pasta, and tried to pretend the music coming from his small speaker was enough to drown out the sound of my own frustration. It didn't stop there. The second sabotage hit harder because it cost me something that was mine, not just an evening. I had a big presentation at work coming up. One of those things that decides whether people keep seeing you as the girl who fetches coffee and prints things, or start seeing you as someone they might actually promote someday. I had talked to him about it for weeks. He knew the date. He knew how nervous I was. He promised he would drive me that morning so I could go over my notes in the passenger seat instead of white-knuckling it through traffic. I woke up early, dressed carefully, checked my slides for the millionth time, and waited in the kitchen with my bag by the door. He was supposed to be ready 15 minutes before we needed to leave. 10 minutes past that time, his phone rang. His sister. Her contact photo flashed on the screen like an alarm. He answered, and his whole face changed. His voice dropped, urgent and soothing. He kept saying things like, "It's okay. Breathe. I'm coming. Just hold on." When he hung up, he told me she was at the emergency room. She had called him from the parking lot, saying she was having a breakdown, that she didn't trust herself, that she needed him there right away. I reminded him gently at first, then not so gently, that I had that presentation, that I couldn't be late. He looked torn for about 3 seconds, then said he could drop me off first, but his hands were already grabbing his keys like his body had decided before his brain caught up. The hospital was in the opposite direction from my job. I could see the math on his face. He told me he was sorry, that he had to go, that I would figure something out. He said, rideshare, bus, anything. I watched him leave, watched his car turn the corner, and then I stood there in the kitchen feeling like an idiot in a blazer. I ended up waiting for a rideshare that took forever because of morning rush hour. And by the time I got to work, the presentation had already started without me. Someone else stepped in. My boss gave me that disappointed look that says, without words, that maybe I wasn't as reliable as she thought. Later that day, he came home with his sister. And she looked totally fine. No swollen eyes, no hospital bracelet, no evidence of having actually seen anyone medical. She said she had just needed to be evaluated, but they released her because the waiting room was too crowded. She said the words in this airy voice, as if she had done nothing wrong. When I asked which doctor she had seen, she couldn't give me a name. My stomach dropped. I tried to explain to him what it had cost me to miss that presentation. I tried to tell him that being there for her didn't have to mean dropping everything every single time she snapped her fingers. He went defensive instantly. He said she would never lie about something like that. Not after what she had been through. He said I was being cruel. Cruel. That word stung more than I expected. We had our first screaming fight that night. And I didn't handle it well. I said things like, maybe you're not ready to have a partner. Maybe you're still married to your sister's trauma. He said I was selfish, that I only cared about my career, that family comes first. I shouted back that I had a family, too, that my future mattered, that I wasn't going to be the third wheel in my own relationship. He slept on the couch that night, which was ridiculous because his sister was already there. She disappeared to her room when we started yelling, but I knew she heard every word. The next day, there were new whispers. His parents called, voices tight, asking what happened, saying they heard I had accused their daughter of faking her mental health crisis. Apparently, his sister had already told them her version before the argument had even cooled. Suddenly, I was the insensitive girlfriend who didn't understand mental illness, who cared more about a work presentation than a possible relapse. I felt my reality slipping. I knew what I had seen. I knew how she had sounded on the phone, how she had walked into the house later, totally composed, not like someone who had just had a severe episode. But I couldn't prove any of that without sounding like a monster. I started to feel like I was losing not just the house, but my grip on my own instincts. There were more little things after that. My stuff would be moved just slightly in ways that made me feel like I was losing my mind. I'd put my favorite mug on the counter and find it hours later back in the cabinet behind other cups. My phone charger would vanish from my side of the bed and reappear coiled neatly in the living room. Laundry I had sorted would be mixed back into the dirty pile if I stepped away for a moment. I started keeping notes. It sounds paranoid, and honestly, it probably was, but I needed something on paper to remind myself that I wasn't inventing this. I wrote down dates, times, what had moved, what had been said. I documented the night she interrupted a conversation about engagement by walking into the room like she had heard a siren. That was the next big blow-up. He and I were lying on the bed, talking quietly about the future, about maybe getting married, about what kind of ceremony we would want. He mentioned saving more aggressively, talked about cutting back on some expenses, what it would take to make it all work. We didn't see her shadow in the hallway. We didn't hear the creak of the floor. She was just suddenly there, in the doorway, eyes wide, like she had walked in on something obscene instead of two adults talking about their lives. She went straight to rage. There was no build-up. 1 minute she was a silent ghost. The next, she was shouting that he couldn't do this to her, that he was abandoning her just like her ex had, that he knew she wasn't ready to live alone. She accused me of using him for money, of having planned this from the moment I saw the house. She yelled that everything nice in that place had come from his sweat, and she wouldn't let some stranger waltz in and take it. I snapped. I know I did, I said, in a very calm voice that did not match the fire in my chest. That she has lived there for 5 years without paying a single bill. And if anyone is taking advantage, it's not me. She went silent for half a beat, like the words had physically slapped her. And then she started crying. Loud, ugly crying, the kind that makes anyone witnessing it feel like the villain. She ran to her room. He ran after her. I sat on the bed and stared at the wall and wondered how I had become the bad guy in a story where I was just trying to build a life with someone. Later, he came back, looking exhausted. Said she was calm now, that she just needed time to adjust. He asked me not to bring up the bills again, because it was a sensitive topic. Sensitive. Living rent-free for half a decade while your brother wears his body out at a warehouse is sensitive. I tried after that to pull back emotionally. I kept my guard up. I stopped sharing as much of myself as before. But feelings aren't faucets you can just shut off. He proposed quietly a few months later during a simple dinner out. Nothing fancy, no big spectacle, just him across the table, hands shaking a little as he held out a small ring and asked if I still wanted to do this with him, despite everything. I said yes, because of course I did. For all his blind spots, for all his cowardice when it came to confronting his sister, he loved me. I felt that. I believed that. I thought maybe with the engagement official, he would finally draw some lines. I underestimated how deep his guilt went. How much power his sister had over that guilt. When we came home that night, engagement still new and shiny on my finger, she was waiting. She had clearly been sitting by the window because she opened the door before we even reached it. She saw the ring before we said anything. For a second, her face went blank. Then she smiled. It was the most unsettling smile I had ever seen. She congratulated us. She hugged him, told him she was happy for him, that he deserved happiness. She even hugged me briefly, her hands cold on my back. She said she would stay out of our way and let us plan. She went back to her room and closed the door gently, and I felt this chill run through me that the heater couldn't touch. For a while after that, she played nice. She asked about venues, about dates, about color schemes. She offered to help with decorations. It almost got me. I almost let myself believe she had turned a corner. Then the little sabotages returned, dressed up in new clothes. She would schedule loud repairs on the house exactly when we had virtual tours with potential venues. She would borrow the car without asking on days we needed to run errands for the wedding and then claim she had forgotten the schedule. I kept writing everything down. I started taking photos. Receipts left on the counter that didn't match the story she told. Bank mail she left open in the trash that mentioned limits being raised because of high balances. A neighbor's offhand comment about seeing her drive a brand new-looking sedan out of a shiny parking lot near downtown. The puzzle took shape slowly. She wasn't broke. She wasn't helpless. She had a full-time job at a company across town, not the occasional shift she had portrayed. That job paid well, according to every salary range search I did on my phone late at night in bed. She had her own money. She had had it for a while. I showed him everything. I waited until he was calm, until his sister was out of the house, until we had enough time to sit down. I spread out the photos, the notes, the printouts. I told him what I had noticed, what I had learned, what the neighbor had said. I watched the color drain from his face. I watched his hands shake. At first, he tried to rationalize it. Maybe she had debts I didn't know about. Maybe the car was leased through work. Maybe the bank mail was a mistake. But the more he looked, the more the cracks showed. There were patterns he couldn't ignore. There were numbers that didn't add up to helplessness. He got quiet in a way I had never seen before. Not the shut-down quiet of someone avoiding a fight, but the brutal quiet of someone realizing their entire reality might have been built on a story someone else told them. He said he needed to talk to her. I said I thought he did too. The confrontation that followed felt like watching a play from the back of the theater. I could hear everything through the thin walls. He asked calm questions at first. She dodged. He pressed. She cried. She screamed. She accused me of turning him against her. She said he was the only person who had ever been there for her. And now he was abandoning her just like her ex. He didn't back down this time. I don't know if it was the evidence in front of him or just finally reaching some limit, but he told her that things had to change. He gave her a deadline, 60 days to find a place of her own. 60 days of him still helping with the bills, with the move, with whatever she needed to get started. But after that, she had to go. She reacted like he had sentenced her to exile. She called their parents, sobbing into the phone loud enough for anyone on the street to hear. She told them he was heartless now, that his girlfriend had poisoned him, that no one cared if she lived or died. They came over that weekend, ready to calm things down. And for once, the universe did me a small favor. They saw the bank mail. They saw the car. They heard the neighbor's comment. They listened to him when he laid out everything. There was this moment in the living room where all four of them were standing there, and I was in the doorway, half in and half out, feeling like an intruder in a family war. His mother looked at his sister and asked point-blank how she paid for that car if she had no money. His sister stumbled over her words. His father frowned. The narrative she had built over 5 years started to crumble right there on the beige carpet. His best friend showed up then, like some kind of chaotic neutral messenger. He had dropped by to say hi and got pulled into the mess in one breath. He sat down, listened, and then said what no one else wanted to say out loud. He told them he had seen this before. He told them their daughter had ruined 2 serious relationships in the past using the same tricks. He told them she had learned that if she whispered about feeling unstable, everyone would drop everything and fall in line. It was brutal. It was also the truth. The deadline stood. 60 days. She hated me openly after that. No more polite masks. No more fragile act when I was around. She slammed doors, banged cabinets, made sure I knew exactly how much she blamed me for everything. I started keeping my packed suitcase under the bed, just in case. 1 week before the deadline, she suddenly became sick. Mysterious stomach pain, late-night trips to the emergency room, vague posts on that social media app about being forced out while she was unwell. She sent him messages saying that if anything happened to her, it would be on his conscience. She called relatives they hadn't spoken to in years and told them a twisted version of the story. The deadline came and went. She was still in her room, still using the bathroom for long showers at inconvenient hours, still leaving passive-aggressive notes about dishes in the sink. He hesitated. I could see it. The guilt had its hands around his throat again. I broke before he did. I packed a bag one afternoon while he was at work. I wrote a short note and left it on his pillow. I walked next door and knocked on the neighbor's door, voice shaking as I asked if I could stay with her for a while. She didn't even blink. She made up the guest bed and handed me a mug of tea and told me I didn't have to explain anything until I was ready. He showed up 2 days later looking like he hadn't slept. He sat at the neighbor's kitchen table and told me he had finally started the legal process. There were forms. There would be a hearing. It would take time, but it was happening. He said he couldn't bear the thought of me building a life anywhere else while his sister slowly strangled his future in that house. The weeks that followed were slow and vicious. His sister did everything she could to make the environment unbearable before she left. Clothes ruined by bleach mysteriously appearing in the laundry. Scratches suddenly gouged into the wooden floor in the bedroom. A sentimental dish that used to belong to their grandmother smashed on the counter with a note that said, "Accidents happen." He documented it all. Photos, dates, everything, because the lawyer had told him to. The sister, who had spent years playing the helpless one, now showed her teeth. She locked herself in her room and claimed tenant rights. He couldn't just change the locks because she had been there so long. The system that was supposed to protect vulnerable people now had to be used against someone who had been faking vulnerability for gain. His parents, finally fully awake, backed him. They offered to help her with deposits for a small apartment. They told her this was the healthy thing, that she needed to stand on her own 2 feet. She spat their kindness back in their faces and posted more bitter messages online about being betrayed by everyone she loved. The day the moving truck finally pulled up, months after that first deadline, the air in the house felt different, heavy, charged. She supervised the movers in icy silence, barely looking at anyone. She took everything she could, including some items that technically were his, but he let it go. He just wanted her out. When the truck pulled away and the house went quiet, he stood in the living room and cried. Not the silent tears of someone who regrets a decision, but the full-bodied sobs of someone who has just realized how much of his life had been spent carrying someone who never intended to walk on their own. I stood there with him, not really sure what to say, my own relief tangled with a strange grief for a relationship that had been damaged beyond repair. We painted the walls a few weeks later. New colors, new furniture arrangements, small changes that felt bigger than they looked. We took down most of the photos and replaced them slowly with new ones. Not just of us, but of friends, of his parents, of dinners and holidays that didn't end in shouting matches. The house started to feel lighter, like it was finally allowed to be what it had wanted to be all along, a home, not a holding cell. His mother reached out to me separately one day and asked if we could meet for coffee. She apologized for not seeing things sooner, for believing her daughter's performance over the quiet reality I had been living. She admitted she had been afraid that confronting one child meant losing her entirely, and in trying to save her, they had almost cost their son his future. I told her I understood more than she thought. I told her I knew what it was like to tiptoe around someone who made their pain everyone else's excuse. I also told her that understanding didn't erase the damage. We both agreed on that. Some things you acknowledge, you work through, you move on from, but they still leave marks. We eventually went through with the wedding. Smaller than originally planned, more intimate, fewer people, more boundaries. We invited his sister because I didn't want to be the reason their relationship stayed permanently broken if there was any chance, however small, of something softening later. She sent a short message saying she would try to make it. On the day of, she didn't show up. Instead, she sent him a long, rambling text about how watching him move on without her was too painful, about how she would always feel like he had traded her in. He read it once, put the phone in his pocket, and walked back to the dance floor. We didn't talk about it again that night. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and the only sound is the hum of the fridge and the distant noise of a late-night car passing by, I think about how close I came to walking away for good. I think about the versions of me that live in other timelines. The ones who didn't stay. The ones who did stay but never spoke up. The ones who turned into shadows in hallways, tiptoeing around someone else's volcano. In this one I stayed, but I also drew a line. I left when I had to. I made him choose. Not between me and his sister, but between living in the past and building an actual future. It still feels messy. It still hurts sometimes. Family wounds don't close just because people move out. But when I wake up in that house now, I don't feel like a guest in someone else's drama. I feel like it's mine too. Not just because there's a ring on my finger or my name on some piece of paper now, but because I fought for it. Because I stopped letting other people's trauma take up every inch of space. Because I finally believed that my sanity, my career, my little dreams of having a house that smelled like my own cooking were worth protecting. People like to say that houses remember what happens inside them. If that's true, then this house remembers the nights of slammed doors and whispered threats and silent tears. It remembers the way guilt echoed louder than any argument. But I like to think it also remembers the first time I sat on the couch after she left, legs tucked under me, hair a mess, eating leftovers straight from the container, laughing with him over some stupid show, and feeling for the first time like the walls were not closing in, but opening up. Maybe one day she will get help for real. Maybe she will figure out how to live without needing someone else to hold her up as a permanent job. Maybe she will hate me forever. That part is not really my story anymore. What I know is that I walked into a house that was already haunted by a living person. And somehow, with a lot of screaming, a lot of crying, and a judge's signature, we managed to let that ghost go. It's not a perfect ending. There's no big group hug, no magically healed family. There's just us, in a small house on a quiet street, paying the bills, arguing over stupid things like who left a wet towel on the bed, making up, learning how to be partners without third parties hijacking every decision. There's just real life, which is messy and petty and painful and on good days, pretty good. And honestly, I'll take that over a drama-filled living room with a permanent third person on the couch any day. If you're wondering whether everything magically stayed peaceful after all of that, it really didn't. Real life is not a movie. And there's no closing credit scene where everyone suddenly learns all the right words to say forever. We still had plenty of nights where something small turned into something loud, and then into that awful quiet that feels heavier than yelling. There were mornings where I went to work with swollen eyes and too much concealer because the argument had dragged past midnight, and neither of us wanted to be the first to back down, even when we had no idea what we were really fighting about anymore. Those arguments weren't always about his sister, at least not directly. Sometimes they were about dishes, or who forgot to take the trash out, or why he seemed distracted when I was talking, or why I shut down instead of saying what I needed. But underneath almost every fight, there was this shared bruise from everything that had happened in that house before. I would say something sharp and then immediately hear my own voice and hate that it sounded a little bit like his sister on her worst days. He would get defensive and then visibly flinch, like he was bracing for another guilt trip, even when I was just asking a normal question. We ended up sitting in a tiny counseling office one evening a week for a while, talking to a tired-looking woman with kind eyes who had clearly heard every possible version of codependent family drama at least 100 times. She didn't do any magic. She just asked annoying questions like why I stayed so long without saying what I really needed, and why he thought it was his job to be the emotional paramedic for every person in his family. She made us actually listen when the other person spoke, instead of rehearsing what we already believed. One thing she said stuck with me more than anything. She said that when you spend years in survival mode, you start to think the constant adrenaline and chaos is normal, and a calm life feels wrong, like the quiet before a storm. She said, of course, the house felt weird after his sister left. We were both waiting for the next explosion. We had to teach our bodies that peace was not the same thing as danger. Little things helped. Making small routines that were ours, that had nothing to do with anyone else. Walking around the block after dinner when the weather was decent. Phones left on the counter. Cooking together on weekends, even when we messed up the recipe and ended up eating cereal instead. Laughing at how bad we were at fixing a crooked shelf and then calling someone who actually knew what they were doing, instead of pretending we had everything under control. His parents came over more often, too, but in a different way. Less frantic, less about putting out fires, more about just sharing a meal and going home. His mother would sometimes pause in the hallway and put her hand on the wall like she was remembering the old days, then shake her head and move on. Once, when we were cleaning up after they left, she told me in a low voice that she used to dread visiting because she never knew what version of her daughter she would get. and now she could finally look forward to it again. I won't pretend I'm some saint in all of this. I still catch myself keeping score, mentally tallying who compromised more that week or who apologized first last time. I still have moments where I feel this irrational spike of jealousy when he gets a message from an unknown number, even though it's usually just a coworker asking to swap shifts. That kind of hypervigilance doesn't vanish just because the original threat packed her things and moved into a one-bedroom apartment across town. Every once in a while, someone will mention his sister. A relative will ask if he has talked to her, if she is doing better, if she ever apologized. He usually answers with something vague, like, they've checked in a few times and she seems stable, and then he changes the subject. I keep my face neutral. I don't join the conversation. Her name still feels like a trigger pulled in slow motion. There was one message she sent months after the wedding that I never told anyone about. It popped up late one night, long after he had fallen asleep on the couch with the television still murmuring. It was long, rambling, and not really an apology. She said she hoped I was happy. She said she knew I would always see her as the villain of my little story. She said that one day I might understand how terrifying it is to watch someone move on without you when you built your entire identity around being their reason for staying. For a second, reading it, I felt this weird ache in my chest. Not sympathy exactly, but that uncomfortable awareness that even the people who hurt us most are still human in their own way. Then I thought about the ruined clothes, the smashed heirloom dish, the way she looked at me like I was an intruder in a life she believed she owned. And the ache turned into something else. Not anger, not anymore, just a very firm no. I deleted the message, not out of pettiness, but because I didn't want it living in my phone, waiting to ambush me on a bad day. If she ever really wants to make things right, it won't be through a half-honest paragraph sent at midnight. It will have to be in person, with real accountability. And honestly, I'm not holding my breath. So no, this is not some inspirational story with a neat moral and soft music fading out while everyone hugs. It's just me, sitting at my kitchen table with a lukewarm cup of coffee, telling you how a woman who was basically a permanent guest in her brother's house almost became the main character in my relationship. It's me admitting that I stayed longer than a lot of people think they would have. That I ignored red flags because I loved him. That I lost parts of myself in the process and had to claw them back, piece by piece. If there's anything close to a point here, it's this: a house is not a home just because someone worked themselves half to death to pay for it. It becomes a home when the people inside stop treating guilt like a mortgage and start treating respect like a non-negotiable bill. We are still late on that payment sometimes. We still mess up. But at least now, when the wind howls outside and the weather turns strange, I don't immediately brace for a new internal storm. I just check the forecast, close the windows, and remind myself that this time, if something feels off, I am allowed to say so out loud before the whole place floods again. One of the last little full-circle moments came on an ordinary weekday when the neighbor knocked on our door instead of the other way around. She needed help carrying in a bulky box, and as we wrestled it up her steps together, she laughed and said she still remembered the day I showed up on her porch with a suitcase and eyes that wouldn't stop darting back at my own front door. She said, "You realize you don't look over your shoulder like that anymore, right?" I didn't. Not until she said it. I walked back to my house after that, key warm in my hand, and for the first time, it hit me that the danger I was always scanning for was not in the building anymore. It was just old muscle memory catching up to a safer, quieter reality. Call to action, honestly, this whole experience taught me so much about boundaries and what I'm willing to tolerate. Have you ever had to draw a line in the sand with someone you love, or in a family situation? What did you do? I'd really love to hear your stories in the comments below.